Well, I think we are good to get started. Folks are loading into the room here. I want to welcome everyone to another edition of Reader Meet Writer, which is sponsored by the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance with the support of the New Atlantic Booksellers Association. My name is Wiley Cash. I'm the New York Times bestselling author of the novel When Ghosts Come Home, which will be out at the end of September. And I want to say a little bit about the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. SIBA is an organization that represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. Normally, a writer like Lydia would be in a bookstore in your community tonight, but COVID has made those kinds of things not impossible as of late, but perhaps a little more risky than we would like. So we're bringing authors to you the best way we can. We've been doing these events since last spring. They've been incredibly successful. You can find a number of our events. We've done over 100 by now, easily, on our YouTube page, Reader Meet Writer TV over on YouTube. You can see all of them, from the most recent Pulitzer Prize winner, David Zucchino, all the way to last night's guest, Mary Gaucher, with her memoir, How Songs Saved by a Song. So that was a wonderful event. So you can find them all there. But tonight we have Dr. Lydia Dugdale and her new book, which just came out, and I'm really excited. Dr. Dugdale is an associate professor of medicine and director of the Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at Columbia University. Prior to her 2019 move to Columbia, she was associate director of the program for biomedical ethics and founding co-director of the program for medicine, spirituality, and religion at Yale School of Medicine. She is an internal medicine primary care doctor and medical ethicist. Her first book, Dying in the 21st Century, provides the theoretical grounding for this current book. She lives with her husband and daughters in New York City, but she is joining us right now from a canyon somewhere in South Texas. And I am thrilled that you are with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Wiley. Thanks so much.
Can we begin with you telling us just a little bit about the lost art of dying?
Absolutely. So the book was written for my patients, and my patients as a general medical doctor is pretty much everyone. When I was at Yale University, where I was for quite some time, about 13 years, I had a very, very large patient panel, which covered everyone from age 18 to more than 100 years old. And part of my job was to accompany people as they aged and as they got sick, unfortunately, sometimes, and as they thought about their dying. And more often than not, many of my patients really didn't think about their dying very much until I would say it was too late. So this was something that has troubled me throughout my medical training and practice. Why is it that we save up the preparation for death until the end? All of us are going to die, right? Mortality is 100%. None of us gets out of this world alive. So why is it that we don't do anything about that? Or why is it that we don't attend to questions of preparing well to die over the course of our lifetime? And that's been a driving question for me. So I've been troubled by this, and a number of years ago, probably about a dozen years now ago, I stumbled across a medieval model for preparing to die well. And it came in the form of handbooks that were widely circulated and translated all over the West for more than 500 years. And these were essentially dummies' guides, if you will, to dying well. And I thought, wow, what if we could resurrect, if you pardon the pun, resurrect these manuals on preparing to die well? What would a modern version look like? And that kind of really set me into motion for the last dozen years, thinking about this question, and most recently resulted in this book.
That's so interesting. I want to ask you a kind of a follow-up question to some of the things that you said, but I want to tell folks at home that if you have a question about anything that Lydia says tonight, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type in your question. Please include your name and the name of your home independent bookstore so we can give you a shout out on the air. But Lydia, just a little bit ago, you talked about having a plan for dying, and that we so often do not consider that and do not plan for that because for whatever reason, we don't confront it. It's just out of our mind until we kind of inch toward that. But many of us will have the misfortune of inching toward our final moments in states where we might not have a say in what our final moments are going to be like. Can you talk about the case that opens the book? It's heartbreaking, not because someone dies, but because someone isn't really allowed to die. Can you tell us about that paradox and kind of the opening case that opens the book?
Sure. Yeah. So I tell the story of a patient of mine that I call Mr. Turner in the book, not his real name, of course. And I met Mr. Turner actually as a corpse. So Mr. Turner had died. I was on the on-call team in the hospital. I was supposed to respond to what typically is a heart attack that results in death. We call it in medical jargon a cardiac arrest. My job was to go assess the situation and start CPR if that's what was indicated. And sure enough, my colleagues and I arrive in the cancer ward to a dead body. The heart had stopped. He wasn't breathing. He was dead. And we, in accordance with the lack of stated wishes to the contrary, we proceeded to resuscitate him. So if people don't want resuscitation at the end of their lives, or for example, if they have suffered a devastating cancer diagnosis, which was the case with this gentleman, he had cancer all throughout his body. It was cancer that had long ago been treated, but had come back without any chance for a cure. He was emaciated, he was skeletal, completely wasted, and he was very elderly. He was in his 80s. So this was a gentleman that when we first approached his body, there was a kind of a collective groan among the medical staff, not because we didn't want to help someone who might be in need of help, but because we knew just from assessing the situation that even if we could get his heart started again, and I use the language in the book of getting the engine going again, even if we could rev up that engine, it wouldn't run for very long because this was a gentleman with a very old heart in a very sick body, and old hearts and sick bodies don't keep ticking forever. And so as the story goes, I resuscitated him. Our team collectively resuscitated him successfully. His daughters came in, it was the middle of the night, and I sat them down. I wasn't his primary doctor, but I felt really strongly that I just needed to make sure they understood just how frail he was and how certain we all were that his heart would not keep beating. And I asked them, if and when his heart stops again, what are his wishes regarding resuscitation? Well, they hadn't really talked about it, but his daughters did not want him to die. They wanted everything to be done. And so a little bit later, about an hour and a half later or so, he died again. We resuscitated him again. And daughters still wanted to press forward. He died again, and they wanted a third attempt at resuscitation. And that third attempt was not successful. But for us as clinicians, it was incredibly traumatic. To his body, it was incredibly traumatic. And this has a big impact, both on family members who witness it, not in the case of this particular gentleman. His daughters still insisted on everything, on all interventions possible, but it can take a real emotional toll for family members and caregivers, especially when we know for certain that it will not be successful. Now, there's a lot of wiggle room there. There's a lot of gray, and I, as a physician, I'm a big advocate of CPR and life support when it looks to be helpful. But in this case, it wasn't.
And I don't want to talk about this here because I want to talk about it a little bit later. But if I'm not mistaken, one of the daughters said, we believe in miracles. We believe that this is, not necessarily in our hands. So with that being said, do everything that you can.
That's right.
To make
yeah. I mean, she said, we're religious people and, we're Christians. We believe God can do miracles. And it turns out, interestingly, I mean, so fascinatingly, that actually people who describe themselves as well supported by their religious communities are the ones most likely to cling to life support and most likely to refuse hospice and palliative care, which is just fascinating because the very people who believe in an afterlife, right? And this life is not all there is. There's an afterlife, there's hope. Death is just a mere threshold. Those are the same people who really have trouble letting go of the technology. So it's fascinating.
It is. One chapter I want to talk about, there's several chapters I want to talk about. The book is so interestingly structured. It's so digestible, largely because of the manner in which you structured it, which I think was so smart. But one chapter I want to talk about is called Finitude. You discuss how Westerners, especially Americans, are incredibly uncomfortable, not only with the idea of themselves dying, but with the idea of death, period. Can you talk about some of the research, some of the conclusions that you found, and the discomfort with those conclusions that are borne out not only anecdotally, but also in the research? Why are we so uncomfortable with it as opposed to that medieval text that you talked about from the, I believe, the 15th century?
Yeah, I mean, a large part of it is that we don't see death. So doctors and nurses see a lot of death. And even if we're not perfect at talking about it, which is certainly the case, there's a way in which a proximity to something makes it less frightening. And think about that for almost anything in your life. I remember the first day I walked into the hospital as a full-fledged MD. And I think it's the only time in my life, maybe the second time in my life, my knees were literally knocking as I walked into the hospital, completely frightened by the unknown. And so, but day two, my knees were not knocking, kind of the end of the first 12-hour day, my knees were not knocking. I had grown in my comfort with the idea of being in the hospital. And the same thing is true with death. So the more we sit with it, the more we see it. Those who have cared for the dying, those who sit with the dying, those who offer counsel to the bereaved are much more comfortable. What has happened in this country? Well, in this country in particular, we have quarantined death itself. And I mean, we could talk about the pandemic as a clear illustration of that, right? Every hospital and nursing home and extended care facility just shut the doors in March of 2020. And many of our elders and those with disabilities who live in long-term care facilities, many still have restrictions actually on visitors, but it took a full year for the government to start opening the doors. So we quarantine death literally and figuratively. We have outsourced our care of the dying, both to palliative care doctors and hospices, which on the one hand, I laud, I support, and I love as a doc. And on the other hand, they have professionalized the care of the dying to the extent that we don't have to do it. So there's that aspect of it. There is, I'm not sure, Wiley, really what part from the chapter you are most interested in. I wonder if you can
just all of it, just the broader take. Americans compared to other parts of the world, Westerners, the different ways that we see death. And one thing, and you mentioned hospitals. Jumping ahead a little bit to the chapter context, which is about the ways, one question I have is about hospitals themselves is the ways in which hospitals have evolved. And I don't know if that's the right word, but since their inception, hospitals have been known as places of hospitality for travelers.
That's
right. Can you talk about the way, maybe jumping off what we talked about with Finitude just now with our discomfort of death, but the ways in which hospitals have come to mean places of death for so many of us?
That's right. So let me back up, because I think what's most helpful with this part of the conversation is to just take a brief historic glimpse at what happened in 100 years ago.
Sure.
So if you'll let me. So
Absolutely.
we have been living through a pandemic, right? The book that Wiley and I are discussing actually riffs off of the bubonic plague of the mid 1300s. And the bubonic plague that swept through Western Europe in the mid 1300s decimated the population. Historians estimate that perhaps as many as 2/3 of Western Europeans died. And in the aftermath of that massive loss of life, that's when we see the gradual development of, I use my hands a lot, the gradual development of these handbooks on the preparation for death. Okay, so pause. That's what I wrote the book about, because that was the model I discovered that seemed so helpful for me to think about how I can help my patients prepare for death. Write a handbook, right? Mm-hmm. But what's happened in the last year and a half is a modern version of plague. And in fact, many people have used that language of plague. Now let's go back 100 years. 100 years ago, we had World War I. 1914 to 1918 was US involvement in World War I. Before the war even ended, we have the outbreak of what some have called Spanish flu, but basically the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920. Medical epidemiologists who look back think maybe there were 4 major waves around the world. We know these waves, ebb and flow, different regions, different times, whatever. Massive loss of life. So we have from 1914 to 1920 worldwide, millions of people died from war and from flu. And then we hit, in the US at least, the roaring 20s, a time of immense economic prosperity. And it was also the time when you have the flapper dress, massive changes in fashion, music, we have talking radio, women get the vote in many states. We also have the birth of antibiotics. We also have the rise in the hospital. So if you look at the number of hospitals, the numbers are in my book, but if you look at the number of hospitals in the late 1800s, it was around 200 or 300. I have the precise numbers in the book. By the 19 teens and 1920s, it was about 6,000 hospitals in the US, which is slightly more than we have today. So what does this mean? This is a long-winded explanation to your question, but when you go through a period of massive death, sustained death worldwide for 6 years, and then you go into economic prosperity, the roaring 20s, a time of hope and a time of disregarding tradition. People were not wanting to dress in mourning, right? Women were dressing in short skirts and wearing, it was all different. Everything was changing. And so with the hospital now omnipresent, because you went from a few hundred to many thousand, the hospital has also a promise of new hope. We have antibiotics. By the 40s, we have chemotherapy. By the 50s, we're transplanting organs and resuscitating. By the 70s, we have test tube babies, right? We have combination chemotherapy. We're keeping people alive in tanks, right? We start cryopreserving corpses, hoping that we will one day discover a cure. So just an incredible shift in the last 100 years that has made the hospital the place to go to. That's where you get your last ditch technology, chemotherapy, antibiotics, what you name it, but you're certainly not going to die at home. And it's also relieved caregivers of the burden of having to do that care in the home. So it's complicated. It's a long, complicated story, but that's a little window into it.
Can you talk about what you mean by the word context? We talked about hospitals, but in calling that chapter context, like the setting for the death, the place of the death, and some different things you discovered or that you experienced about people dying in various locales.
Yeah, I think in calling the chapter context, I really was thinking about the shift from home to hospital, right? So that sort of context. But so I think I don't want to go on record, and I certainly don't go on record in the chapter as saying that the hospital is always a bad place to die. and that the home is always a good place to die. And I tell stories in the hospital of, in the book, of patients who had said they would never die in the hospital, but then they found in the end it made the most sense for whatever reason. Maybe the home wasn't set up to accommodate the hospital equipment that was needed to care for the person well. Maybe the home had stairs that were impossible for the person to climb. Maybe there were many children around, and a young mother dying of cancer didn't want to leave that impression on the home space of her dying. But by dying in a hospice or in a hospital, it removed all of the rich sensory aspects of dying from the home, right? So she was still with her kids and surrounded by kids. But so there are many different reasons why the hospital may very well make sense. But there are also many reasons to consider the home, especially when more than 80% of Americans say they want to die at home. That is our preference. Yeah. Americans on the whole want to die at home, not hooked up to machines, surrounded by those they love, those we love. And yet we don't put into place what is necessary to make that possible. So my book is kind of a nudge to help people be thinking now, even young people, right? There's no reason not to think about what it means to die well. Maybe we'll get there, but I'll sneak ahead to one thing I often ask people to do is imagine who will be with you at your deathbed, who's going to be surrounding you, and then work backward. And this is to underscore the point that dying well is actually all wrapped up in living well. Mm-hmm. So if you know who you want to be with you at the end, what is the state of those relationships now? And how can you be nurturing, building, investing in those relationships now so that they are richer throughout your life, right? You live well to die well, but then they'll also be all the richer as you're dying. So
yes, yeah, and I can't remember exactly which chapter it is in, so maybe I'm jumping ahead a bit, but you draw a distinction between dying alone and I think dying lonely.
Lonely dying, yeah.
Lonely dying. Can you talk about those two things?
Yeah, right. So being alone is not necessarily loneliness. And in fact, probably all of us need to be alone at some point. And certainly introverts need to be alone a lot more to sort of recharge and reset. So being alone and even dying alone is not necessarily loneliness. So how could dying alone be fine? Well, I talk about in the book, sometimes people who really strive not to be a burden on others throughout their lives. We all know people like this. By the way, it's really good to try to be a burden to others. That helps us both learn to receive help when we need it. And it also helps those around us to learn to give help, right? So it's okay to be a burden, but we all know people, my grandmother, case in point, hated to be a burden on anyone. She wanted to do everything herself, take care of it herself. Well, those individuals might very well wait until everyone has left the hospital or left the room. And then they sort of, give up the ghost, to use the language. Then they let themselves die. That is so common. People who don't want to be a burden wait until everyone goes home and then they die. They don't want to die when everyone's there. That'll be a burden. That's dying alone, but that's not lonely dying. Mm-hmm. That person has just been surrounded by those they love, etc. There's also the question always comes up about COVID. And I have to say, so I'm a internal medicine doctor. I moved to New York City 6 months before COVID hit, and I was thrown into the thick of it. Our neighborhood in Columbia, where my hospital is, was one of the worst hit, and I did a lot of COVID care. And in the early weeks of COVID, March, April of 2020, I was so grateful for the iPad technology to help patients communicate with their loved ones. I couldn't see any other way to do it initially when we didn't understand the virus. We didn't know how it was transmitted. There were PPE shortages everywhere, right? It only made sense But we had this wonderful technology face to face with those you love. And sometimes it would be families all over the place joining the same Zoom link, which would have never been possible. Mm-hmm. So, when things started to ease up and we maintained those strong prohibitions on visitation, that's when I think it got bad. It was wrong. And we should have, especially hospitals and extended care facilities that didn't open up, that should have been different. So that was imposing dying alone that ultimately felt wrong in the early stages of COVID. I don't see any other way to do it. And thank goodness for the technology. Now, lonely dying is a different thing. And in the chapter on community, I talk about this phenomenon that's common in large urban settings where people live forever and they often live alone in apartments and they die and no one knows. And it only comes to the attention of authorities when their bank account stops paying automatic rent because they run out of money, or the stench of a decaying body comes to the attention of the neighbors. And I tell some very sad stories in the book, not to weigh people down, but to highlight this phenomenon, very common in New York City and very common in Tokyo, Japan. Aging populations, people live alone. You have the anonymity of a huge city where no one's checking up on you. So not to be morbid, not to be, make people sad, but to say, hey, we're all going to die. Who are our people?
Yeah.
And how can we stay connected?
And start forging those relationships and having those honest conversations. That's sooner right. than later. That sounds kind of cliche but it's absolutely true. And it's funny what you were saying about people waiting to die alone, not to make this about me, but my father passed away at home in 2016 and we were all at his bedside and he was literally alone for maybe 3 minutes. And that's when he passed away after, a couple of weeks. And I do think he waited. I thought mostly because I think we got on his nerves, not because he was afraid of being disturbed. But I think he was like, oh, thank God, see ya, finally some peace. One chapter and one thing that I was really interested in the chapter Fear is the war on death. Can you unpack that phrase and give us an idea of what you mean by that and talk about how that war is waged?
Yeah, so in that chapter, I rely some on the work of the great literary giant Susan Sontag, who wrote a book, years ago now, Metaphor is Illness. Illness is Metaphor. Susan Sontag, interestingly, had 3 different cancers over the course of her lifetime. And it was probably her early, and I will say somewhat primitive treatment, which was state of the art at the time, but her early cancer treatment that led to the subsequent cancers, or at least one of the subsequent cancer. And it certainly was the one that ended up killing her. But she wrote some interesting things about illness and the body, but she has this fascinating way of describing our language that we use both as healthcare practitioners, but also in the broader public to describe our resolve that we will defeat death, we will defeat illness, disease. So we hear it all the time. I'm going to beat this cancer. I'm going to kick this cancer. I'm going to war. This is a war on cancer. The language of victory to describe cure or even to describe remission is very common. And that language, if you think about military language, we rely on this, I don't know, perhaps false optimism, but this resolve of optimism to kind of get the troops going, right? You're not going to send people into battle saying, guys, looks pretty bad, go to it, right? Yeah. So on some level, maybe our nature, our psyches, our communities, we keep telling each other we're going to take this one. We've got this. I'm a fighter. She's a fighter. So that language is fine as long as it is always coupled with an acknowledgement of finitude. But I'm immortal. But everyone dies. But at some point, I'm going to die. And so I'm all for, doctors often say, give hope while, preparing for the worst. That's kind of the way we operate. So yes, hope, but also keep reality and the possibility of not a good outcome in the back of your mind. I don't think we have to dwell on the negative, but we do have to, we have to keep it in our minds.
Absolutely. In the chapter you title Spirit, you discuss, kind of larger existential questions. And you talk about that even people who don't identify as being spiritual or religious or having a sense of faith, they become more faith-based. They might rely on a newfound faith as they begin to confront their own mortality. Can you talk about that? Not phenomenon is the wrong word, but that experience of witnessing those kinds of transitions and openings and
Yeah, no, this is a big question. This is the old idea: there are no atheists in foxholes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I have cared for patients, and I at some point in that chapter, I tell the story of a patient of mine. I call Mrs. Blatchley, working class, really tough woman, and in her toughness, partly because she'd had such a tough life, she had dismissed any thought of religion or, that's a crutch. I'm not going to be dependent on some God or something. I don't need that. And then I was caring for her as she was dying. Mm-hmm. And suddenly she was trying to make sense of all of this, but she dismissed it for so long. And her delirium started getting worse as infections were kind of vying for her consciousness. And it ended, at least as far as I could interpret things as her physician, with her having not resolved these issues. She'd had no resolution. And that's really why I include that chapter in the book, because I don't want people to die with no resolution. Yeah. Now, I'm not prescriptive in the book about what people should believe. That's not my expertise. But I give examples of different belief systems in the book. It's not, again, that some people have been critical that I haven't done a kind of systematic review of how every major religion dies or how they handle death. And that's not the project. That book has been written a long time ago, but that's not what it's about. So I'm not prescribing a particular belief system. I'm saying, hey, look, we're all going to die. There are no atheists in foxholes. I've cared for patients where it was really bad at the end. And part of my job as a doc is to say, this is yet another issue you need to address over the course of your life, in the context of your community, your family, your loved ones, whoever it is, whoever you define, and don't save it up for the end, because you really will live better and die better if you come to some sort of peace about these existential questions, these questions of meaning and purpose. So that's what I'm after in that chapter.
Certainly. And speaking of questions, we're going to have a little bit of time here at the end in just a few moments. If folks have questions, make sure to go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question, mention your name and the name of your home independent bookstore. I want to ask you, before we turn toward audience questions as they begin to come in, Lydia, the final chapter, before you move into some artwork, and we can talk about that as well, the chapter Life. Is there one parting thought from that chapter that you would like us to take away with us tonight after this discussion?
Yeah, so the last chapter is really long, and it's kind of, I pull together the themes of the book and then give a lot of very practical takeaways, mm-hmm. if you will. Things like that do not resuscitate order. I'm not saying that that's what everybody should have, but things like questions of frailty. So how do we engage with the hospital, the healthcare setting, as we become more frail? And how do you know if someone's frail or not? I take some of those questions on and give some advice, some research on those questions. And then probably my favorite takeaway, if I have to give one, is something that I've been thinking about a lot. lately, what does it mean to become smaller?
Mm-hmm.
I've been hanging around Ivy League institutions for a long time, and I've watched some of my most beloved professors become very old, emeritus, and then really take on these smaller existences. I've seen this of course, in my own family, but my own family, is not very fancy family. So it's not like we went from greatness to smallness, but to see sort of great people in public figures, right? I write about the death of Aretha Franklin and John McCain in the book, and I describe their funerals. To see going from bigness to smallness, we are all on the way to smallness, actually, right? Because even if you live a long time, even if you remain famous and well regarded, what you are able to do becomes smaller. Memories become smaller, place becomes small. It all becomes smaller as we age toward our deaths. And so if that's the case, how might that affect our living? Mm-hmm. And would we make different decisions? So I've been thinking about my own becoming smaller. I'm in my 40s, mid 40s. What does becoming smaller mean for my family? How would I write differently? How would I interact with people differently if I'm on my way to smallness? So it's sort of maybe it's not what we should talk about. I think the world is about talking about bigness, and I live in New York City, so maybe that's why I want to talk about smallness.
No, I think it's a beautiful sentiment to end on before we take the questions that are coming in from the audience. And you have this really beautiful moment with, I think it's your grandmother. You go in and she's at the table finishing a meal, and she smiles, not because you're you, but because someone's approaching her. Mm-hmm. And you go down the hall to her room, and it's this small room, and it's the totality of her life. And I thought, my God, if I had my room, what would I want in there? And who would I want in there? Mm-hmm. And would I want any of the crap that I have in my room now? No, I wouldn't, but I would want these treasured things. And I think it's a beautiful, beautiful way to lead into audience questions. I found this book so affirming and so resonant. And thank you for sharing with us tonight, Lydia. Ruth Ellen, her bookstore is Story and Song in Fernandina Beach, Florida. She asks, what were the biggest surprises and takeaways from these 16th century handbooks that struck you as being applicable to the dying process in modern times that propelled you to write your book?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth Ellen, and thanks for the question. So the very first iterations of these, ars moriendi is Latin for art of dying. So it was the ars moriendi genre of literature. The very first iterations came, the author's anonymous, but we think that the author or authors were related to the Western church. Why? Because the church was the leading social authority at the time in Western Europe. So massive loss of life, bubonic plague, Black Death, you name it. Then the people kind of respond and say, we're screwed. What happens if death sweeps through again? It's going to, whether it's plague or famine or war, we're going to die. We don't want to have to depend on the priests to sort of do the work for us. We want to do it ourselves. Mm-hmm. So the ars moriendi, so then of course the social authorities, the church issues the first version, we think somebody related to the church, and then they take off like wildfire. So very quickly, many different iterations develop. There's the rise of Protestantism. There are Protestant versions. There are Jewish versions. There are non-religious versions. By the 1800s, the time of the Civil War in the United States, the former president of Harvard University is Drew Faust. She has this lovely book on the Civil War called This Republic of Suffering. I think if you're a Civil War buff, check that one out. But she writes in that book about how during the Civil War, whether you're from the North or the South, whether you're religious or not, if you were brought up well, attending to what it means to die well was part of life.
Hmm.
And so now the closest thing we get to that is like estate planning or putting money into a retirement account. But it was different. It was different for more than 500 years. So now you're asking me to summarize across the genre of literature what was most compelling. And then of course there are many variations. But I'll say what was most compelling to me is that it was about personal, like lay empowerment or individual empowerment, not to die alone, right? Because you're still dying in the context of the community. And the Ars Moriendi genre was very much about community. It was about the life of the community. But it was not relying on the social authority to do the work for you. And as a doc, right? So who is the social authority when it comes to dying? Well, it's often, the nurses will say it's the nurses. And actually, it is the nurses. But as a physician, we like to think it's us. And so it's the medical people who end up kind of being those intermediaries between life and death. And we're not totally reliable. And our healthcare systems aren't totally reliable. And so that's why I wanted to, in a sense, empower my patients, much as the Ars Moriendi empowered the laity for more than 500 years, empower individuals to work out these questions in the context of their families and then, or their communities. And then kind of, I try to lay out what some of those big themes were that emerged out of that genre of literature.
And if I can say one thing in closing, Lydia, I found this book, I was searching for the words, and I think that the word that you just used here to close us out, empowering, I found this book to be very empowering and very clear-eyed and very focused on confronting questions and ideas that we all need to come to terms with before someone else has to come to terms with them on our behalf, and talk about being a burden for those of us who do not want to be a burden. But thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight. This was a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you so much, Wiley, and thanks to all who attended.
Good night, everybody. Hope your time in Texas goes well, Lydia. Be well. Travel
Thank
safe.
you.